In the last 4 weeks, the total number of infected children has just about doubled from the first 5 months. If you look at the stat sheet on July 9th, there were approximately 200,000 confirmed cases in children. By August 6th, that number rose by 180,000. So it literally doubled in a month. That's what the COVID-19 cases per 100 children looks like by date. As you can see, the ratio of children who are testing positive for COVID continues to go up. They even have a better chart here. This shows you the growing percentage of confirmed U.S. coronavirus cases in the red is children. Back in April 16th, children made up 2% of the total cohort of infected people. Children now make up 10% of the cohort of infected people. So what we know is that children are contracting it, children are carrying it, and children are passing it around. I know there's this lovely conversation of, it's only a few kids are going to die. Like, what was it? Betsy DeVos came up with, I don't know, 1,100, 1,200 kids by ratio would die across the country. She's like, oh, it's a small number considering how many kids there are. Like, oh, really? I'd like to roll back the tape and find the last time in American history where we were like, hey, for the good of the nation, we're just going to genocide 1,200 kids. It's not a thing. So Betsy DeVos is a large part of the reason why we're where we're at now. If you don't know who Betsy DeVos is, I'm going to tell you. Betsy DeVos is an extremely wealthy person. Her family is the Amway family. She is the heiress to the Amway family fortune. Her and her brother Eric Prince, who is the owner of the mercenary company Blackwater, that then had to change its name because they committed so many atrocities and war crimes in the Middle East, and they're not even the U.S. military. So the DeVosses have like $1 billion. They've spent most of their lifetime fighting public education in the state of Michigan where they live, and constantly pushing to get more and more private schools and religious schools because, public schools, they teach Marxism, but private schools, they teach Jesus. And so apparently, that's their thing. Hold on, wait a minute. I think I have a button for this. There he is. What's up, brother? Jesus knows what's up. So, let's take a brief rundown memory lane. Remind you who Betsy DeVos is and how she got us to where we are now. This is Betsy DeVos. Perhaps you recognize her from such movies as 101 Dalmatians or any movie adaptation of Hansel and Gretel. So here's some of the things that Betsy DeVos had to say before she became the Secretary of Education for under the Trump regime. So here you go. In 2015, before she became Education Secretary in the administration of President Donald Trump, she said traditional public schools are, quote, a dead end. So she and her husband, Amway heir Richard DeVos, have spent time and money on school choice advocacy for decades. They were instrumental in pushing through Michigan's charter school law in '93, and they support programs that use public money for private and religious tuition, a position that critics say show her desire to privatize U.S. public education. As Education Secretary, DeVos has said repeatedly that her definition of holding school districts, quote, accountable is how many alternatives to traditional public schools they offer to families. Here's a quote from a speech she gave at the South by Southwest convention. We are the beneficiaries of startups, ventures, and innovation in every other area of life. But we don't have that in education because it's a closed system, a closed industry, a closed market. It's a monopoly, a dead end, and the best and the brightest innovators and risk takers steer way clear of it. As long as education remains a closed system, we will never see the educational equivalents of Google, Facebook, Amazon, PayPal, Wikipedia, or Uber. We won't see any real innovation that benefits more than a handful of students. So to start with, education is a monopoly, yet Betsy DeVos is taking public funds and funding thousands of religious and private institutions across the country. That does not sound like a monopoly. That literally sounds like thousands of competitors in a market. Number two, it's a closed system because it's a government system. We have the same problem with the post office, okay? Education is not supposed to turn a profit, just like the post office isn't supposed to turn a profit. Every time somebody wants to complain that we spend money on a government program and, there's no profit from it, please remind them that our military budget is, I don't know, somewhere close to $1 trillion a year. Yeah, $1 trillion a year. I don't see them they're turning a profit for corporations by, stealing other countries' resources, but they're not turning a profit for us, for the United States of America, for taxpayers. Like, that's $1 billion a year black hole. I don't see Betsy DeVos and her family screaming about fucking, the police don't generate enough revenue. Actually, wait a minute. I take that back. Let's not give them any ideas. The last thing I need is more police suppression for profit. Oh, good Lord. Just 3 weeks after becoming Education Secretary, DeVos displayed her unwavering focus on school choice and a misunderstanding of the historically black colleges and universities by calling these institutions pioneers of school choice. Actually, black students were barred from white institutions and had no choice but to go to schools specifically created for them. Well played, Betsy DeVos. Well played. She's refused to say whether the federal government should privatize schools that accept public money from discriminating against some students. She said it was up to the states. So basically, Betsy DeVos and her family, her entire, for generations of her family, they've been fighting this. They want schools to be privatized. They want education to be for profit, and they want to have more God and less critical analysis in schools. That's basically the three-pronged attack of the DeVos family. Now, why am I wasting time talking about shit that Betsy DeVos used to say? Because out of the time machine and back into last month, Education Secretary faced backlash after demanding schools reopen full-time amid pandemic. So, needless to say, since Betsy DeVos, somebody with no experience in education, who then became the Secretary of the Department of Education in the Trump regime, like most of his other appointees, having no experience, basically she was appointed to just blindly agree with Donald Trump and do what he wants while continuing upon her family's quest to utterly destroy public education because it doesn't turn a profit for 18 old rich white people. And God forbid there's a system anywhere in the United States of America where a small handful of old white people don't get to profit. Dun, dun, dun. I know, crazy shit, right? So Betsy DeVos faced backlash for demanding that schools reopen full-time in-person instruction in the fall, even in places where the virus is surging. And then she doubled down on a threat to cut funding to schools that don't. American investment in education is a promise to students and their families. If schools aren't going to reopen and not fulfill that promise, they shouldn't get the funds and give it to the families to decide to go to a school that is going to meet that promise, DeVos told Fox News Sunday. Yeah, like private schools, like the ones that Trump's son is going to, or the ones that Rick Scott's grandkids are going to. Yeah, all those private schools, which are doing full telecommuting learning because rich people aren't going back to school. There's going to be the exception to the rule, but the rule should be the kids go back to school this fall, DeVos said, and where there are little flare-ups or hotspots that can be dealt with on a school-by-school or case-by-case basis. Yeah, that's what we'll deal with. DeVos didn't say under which authority she and Trump would have to cut off school budgets. So essentially, Betsy DeVos came out, said all schools need to reopen. They need to figure it out for themselves because everybody's school district is different. And she fell on the grenade for Trump. And then she just rode off into the sunset and vanished. And this was back in early July, maybe? So nobody's seen DeVos for like 3 weeks. Here's why. Because after she made that announcement, she scurried back to her private compound in Michigan and began slinging around articles and rules for the education department to shift resources from public schools to private schools and Catholic schools, which is exactly what she said she was going to do as a private citizen before she even became the Secretary of the Department of Education. So she fell on the grenade July 13th for Donald Trump. Then on July 17th, she issued a press release about shifting resources from public schools to private schools. Now, this is her schedule. I don't know if you guys know this, but every single person who, is a government administrator, they all have a public schedule. which you can view. They have a public calendar. Even Trump has a public calendar. Betsy DeVos's calendar is much like her soul, empty, barren, and devoid of content. There's literally nothing there. Seems people noticed. Betsy DeVos publicly absent as critical decisions are made on public school reopenings. She literally vanished. As public schools grapple with the challenge of reopening during a pandemic, public education advocates are criticizing Education Secretary Betsy DeVos for working remotely from Michigan, where she owns a sprawling waterfront estate with round-the-clock security detail paid for by taxpayers. Wow, that must be nice. And while keeping herself largely physically distanced as the coronavirus continues to spread, DeVos has been a forceful advocate for Trump's demand that schools reopen full and in person, potentially placing millions of teachers and students at risk of infection. It's a bit of a mixed message for DeVos, a billionaire heiress, major GOP donor, and charter school advocate who had no experience with public education before she became the education secretary. DeVos is the nation's top education official, as school administrators deal with one of the biggest health crises facing the nation: how to safely bring 51 million American children back into classrooms or administer virtual education. Questions persist as to why DeVos requires full-time protection from the U.S. Marshal Service. It's been reported that she started receiving round-the-clock protection shortly after she was confirmed. She's the only cabinet official with such an arrangement, and in all, her security detail has cost taxpayers at least $25 million. Isn't it ludicrous how the richest people always cost us the most, and yet they're the ones who scream about welfare, welfare, welfare? She's getting $25 million in free armed security while she sits in her 200,000 square foot mansion staring out at her 7 yachts that are moored in Lake Michigan, complaining that poor kids need to go back to public school. Must be nice. So it turns out DeVos has been holding events not listed on her public calendar, including several sponsored by the Conservative Federalist Society. She's also participated in a few events related to private schools and advocacy for vouchers, including a roundtable July 23rd at a private Christian school in Ohio, and 2 events in the Carolinas with Vice President Pray Away the Gay Mike Pence. Days after DeVos and Pence's visit, July 29, to a classroom at Thales Academy, a network of private community schools in North Carolina, to highlight the school as a model for reopening, several 4th grade students were asked to quarantine after a student tested positive for COVID-19. She continues to echo the president's demand that public schools reopen for in-person instruction regardless of the levels of infection in their local communities. She also insists that it isn't her job to help localities determine how to do it safely. The Secretary of Education said it's not her job to figure out how to administer education in the middle of a global pandemic. Now, I may not be the sharpest knife in the drawer, but I'm pretty sure that the Secretary of Education should be somebody whose office gives guidance to schools as to how best to stay open during a global pandemic. But no, DeVos has literally nothing to say. It's gotten so bad, these are the billboards people are putting up in Michigan on the road that leads to her mansion so that her or her entourage have to drive by this crap every single day. This is a real thing, okay? Now, let's get to the crux of the situation. Why is Betsy DeVos pushing so hard for kids to go back to school, other than the fact that, she likes to lick the brown shirt boot of Donald Trump? Because, of course, white nationalists of a white nationalist feather love to flock together. So there's 2 different reasons. Number one, and we already read about it, is the DeVos family has been working for decades to fully privatize and Christianize the American education system. There's profit to be made and there's converts to be had. And that's like number 1 on Betsy DeVos's wish list. But the larger reason of why they're pushing so hard to get schools open is because in America, the average cost for yearly daycare for a child is approximately $10,000 a year. School, especially if you are not a homeowner, is essentially free. Our school system is viewed by Betsy DeVos and the rest of our government as cheap daycare so that poor people can go back to work. And Betsy DeVos doesn't care about education. She doesn't care about kids learning things. She doesn't care about the kids going to school to, learn critical thought and analysis and, the ability to think on their feet and, know stuff. Betsy DeVos, much like Donald Trump, much like Rick Scott, much like all the other wealthy elitists who want schools to reopen while their family does private telelearning, they all want schools to open because they need all of these kids' parents to go back to work, fetching them coffee, washing their cars, mowing their lawns. The wealthy desperately need the poors to get back to work. And unfortunately, the poors keep having children, and we got to put them somewhere. So Betsy DeVos, Donald Trump, thank you for pushing to have the American daycare system open back up. And as soon as y'all get fucking run out of office, hopefully the next people who come in will make education the actual priority of school instead of being daycare for the poor. I hope so.